We need to get rid of this horrible system. In order to do that, we're going to need people to take power in their own communities and workplaces. And when you get millions of people on the streets marching against war, people can see there is another superpower. It's called people power. It's called workers' power. That's why it's so significant that unions, the CTU, Workers' First Union, the nurses and others have supported the anti-war movement, and we mobilized the people.
To summarize, the revolution will not be televised, the revolution will not be memed, the revolution will not go viral, the revolution will happen in meat space. Kia ora koutou, and welcome to One of 200, New Zealand's Media and Politics podcast. I'm joined today by co-host Josephine.
Kia ora.
Hi Josephine, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. It is very difficult times across the world, very uncertain times. I was at this online Hui with the United Nations team of Cuba last night for this emergency meeting where they briefed supporters from across the world, people who are interested in Cuba's situation across the world about the situation in Cuba. So there were many doctors, pediatricians, scientists, students, and that who spoke. So I didn't get that much sleep last night, but very much enraged about the U.S. empire, which is today's topic.
Oh, awesome. Bring the rage. Yes, good. And our guest today is Carolan. How are you feeling today? Are you enraged as well about the U.S. empire?
Is there ever a day that we're not enraged about what the empire's up to? Yeah, and the rest of them, all the other empires too. Yeah, the Europeans, all the people who are trying to crush people out there. And it's also freezing cold here in Auckland too. So climate change, brilliant.
There's a thing called winter. I mean, sometimes it feels like it's been abolished of late, or it does in Christchurch, but it has come, it has arrived. Yeah. Anyway, so I thought I'd start off by we're basically talking to you because there's an upcoming rally. So I thought maybe if you just quickly introduce that, and we can talk about it again at the end of the podcast.
Sure.
So what's happening, when and where?
Yeah, so the Stop the Wars movement took to the streets after the first attacks on Iran began. We'd had a public meeting in January with Socialist Aotearoa about the attack on Venezuela and the abduction of Maduro, which brought a big crowd. And we got an even bigger crowd, including counter demonstrators from the monarchists and the Zionists, when we held a similar monthly meeting on Iran. But there was a wide group of people invited to be speakers. We had Sandra Gray from the CTU. We had Marmot Davidson, the co-leader of the Green Party, Phil Twyford, who is Labour's Associate Foreign Affairs Speaker, and a number of other unions, groups, parties, the Cuban Solidarity Friendship Group there, for example, there too. Other people who were concerned that the Trump regime and the American empire were preparing for another series of wars, grabs, and at the time, everything from Greenland to Colombia was in their sights. We were expecting an attack in Nuestra America first, but actually the major imperial attack, obviously happening for the last 3 years in Palestine with the genocide in Gaza, the annexation of the West Bank, but now invasion into Lebanon, and then the beginning of the regional war. We are in a regional war. We are in what could turn into a world war, and many of the people in that room were in agreement. We needed to take to the streets. Building a coalition with people from different religions, different cultures, different political ideologies and viewpoints is always challenging. But we had some of experience of this 20 years ago when we defended the Iraqi people from the brutal attack from the American Empire then, which left 1 million dead from the war itself and another million or two dead from the sanction regime, both before and after. And this is what lies in store for any country that thinks it will be liberated by American bombs. Just look at all the countries that they've devastated in the last 100 years. Actually, this has been going on for quite a long time. I've met comrades from the Philippines and learned quite a lot about their struggle against both Spanish and American colonizers and empire, often ruling not just through formal, if we like to think of imperialism as, the formal conquest of your country turned into a province of something like the Roman Empire. I think imperialists these days are much wiser. They use comprador classes. They use the own more right-wing elements of the national bourgeoisie, if you like, to rule through many of these countries. So, but I think many people can see through these sophisticated methods these days. And I think Trump is actually a blessing. He's the kind of rude awakening that Obama's smooth jazz, just basically covered up his role being the Lord of the Drones. I think Trump is just the bare naked face. He's a billionaire pedophile rapist who sums up everything we need to know about the worst of American capitalist culture. And of course, they want to grab, smash, steal, and kill anyone who stands in the way from getting their hands on resources. So although this is a time of war, theft, and the total greed of the billionaire class, it is also a time of resistance and now revolution. Look at how the people of Albania have responded to the land grab by Kushner and Ivanka Trump, wanting to build a luxury resort, but on a key island that's got strategic value, etc. Who in the right mind would allow this corrupt, evil, billionaire, pedophile class own an island with bunkers and chambers underneath where they can do whatever they want? We all know, and indeed the whole world just calls this particular American capitalist class at the minute the Epstein class, because it sums up their total moral bankruptcy in a very fundamental way. So yes, we are trying to build the march this Saturday at 2 p.m. Starting in Aotearoa Square, mobilizing to go down to the center of evil in Auckland, the US consulate on Quay Street, where we want to show that Aotearoa resists this empire as well.
Yes, well, Aotearoa should resist this empire, but of course you asked who in their right mind would let someone build a bunker. Well, Peter Thiel was granted citizenship in this country, and we are implicated in many ways. But one of the things we're talking about, the US role, and I think it's worth, you're talking about the history, but I think it's also worth noting that that they are involved in everything. Absolutely everything, including Russia, Ukraine. They have a very culpable role in that war beginning in the first place. People were writing books about how the US and NATO were goading Russia into a wider war beforehand. So, right. And then of course, once it happens, everyone pretends ignorance and pretends that it's the day one syndrome. Nothing happened before Russia invaded. But they're also involved in every bad thing that's happening in the world, and perhaps that's the nature of their global reach. But they're involved in Sudan. They're involved in the violence throughout Latin America and instability there, political shenanigans, corruption, They are involved in the structural violence throughout the world. They're involved in virtually everything. And so I was wondering, like, I imagine that for all three of us, there's a certain ancestral pull to say to have a resentment against the British Empire, and maybe even particularly Winston Churchill that we might share.
Oh, yes.
But I mean, into this day and age, the US empire is effectively the great Satan. Would you agree with me? And if so, how did you go back into your past and tell me how you came to that conclusion? I'll start with you, Josephine.
Oh, with me. All right. I was just, feeling really excited to march the streets, listening to Joe. Joe has that, effect on people, which is what we want, in trade unionists, in just civil society, in the people. This is about people power against the U.S. empire, right? That's what we're left with, what we have, and the most powerful thing in the world is still people power. They are building at the moment. This is the U.S. empire, talking about the evils, the satanic qualities of the U.S. empire. One thing that's alarming me is the fact that the U.S. corporations, this oligarchic class in the United States, which owns this tech sector, right, including Peter Thiel, OpenAI, Google, they're displacing Dalit communities, Adivasi communities in India to build data centers. And the weird thing is you mentioned comprador class, Joe, and what we can see in India, what happened in India is, since independence and during the anti-colonial struggle and that, the British Empire tried to create a kind of a system that wouldn't be a challenge to the empire, right? So we adopted Western style liberal democracy, which then gave way to neoliberalism, IMF reforms in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we can see that, the path that India's politics has taken since then is that we had a rapid decline into fascism. And now we have this comprador, proto-fascist government in India, in Modi, who was inviting US oligarchs, these Epstein class billionaires, to come build data centers in India, which are, what good does it do to India? Me, we are just becoming another vassal state of this empire. And the United States is trying to leverage whichever comprador government it can in order to counter the rise of China, in order to counter the rise of a multipolar world. So I'm extremely enraged, as a person from India, but also just living in this world, looking at what is going on across the world. Yes, indeed, the United States is the big Satan of our times. What we can see what's going on in Cuba, where there are some estimates that there's an excess of 18,000 deaths among children in the last 10 years or so as a result of this genocidal embargo. I mean, the list of crimes is endless. And how is the United States also trying to cause another war, which could have such horrific implications for the world, for example, against China, right? Arming Taiwan, and how New Zealand is kind of playing into that. We had the MPs, visit Taiwan 4 times or something, against what China wants, in terms of the China-New Zealand relationship. And New Zealand MPs, including left MPs, becoming good dogs for the empire. So, yes, this is a satanic empire, if you want to describe it like that. But I actually prefer to describe it as as a phase of capitalist imperialism, with the United States currently being the seat of the empire, the head of the empire, just like what Che Guevara said, right? While envisaging the destruction of imperialism, it is necessary to identify its head, which is no other than the United States of America.
Yeah. So I'll just jump in and explain that the word you're using, comprador, is a Portuguese word which was used originally for people, intermediaries, so fixers, and it came to represent the class of people who were effectively the cat's paws of the empire doing their work, the local people, the native people, which in turn, I think, evolved in the Cold War into this in a post-colonial context or a neo-colonial context. We often had people referred to as nationalists who were in fact working for the empire. And the same sort of they had the same claim to legitimacy, which was that their identity was of the people who they are exploiting, which gave them some legitimacy, often not in the eyes of the locals, where you had people like Goni sent to Bolivia, who was called a Yankee by the locals, or people like Singlanri, Chalabi, Ngodentiem. These are all people who spend a lot of time in the US and then they're sent there as nationalists when they're actually really working for the US. But the reason I wanted to start with a historical background is that I think that it's good for people to understand where we're coming from in order to understand what's happening today. And for me personally, I grew up in, I was born in 1970. So in the 1970s, there was a time that extended through into the 80s of considerable criticism of US foreign policy and its actions and an openness that would be absolutely alien to people now. The way the US empire operates is in the passive voice. It used to be said of the British Empire that it was acquired in a fit of absence of mind, which is a really self-serving way of talking about their vicious and vicious conquests of other places and relentless brutality is basically barbarians. And we have the same thing with the US. They're always being sucked into quagmires. They're always, it's always about personalities or it's never about structural things, and there's never any intent. They have like an unwise attachment to trying to spread democracy to people, which has this double message because it has a racist connotation that their victims are in fact too primitive to become democratic, and that is why they end up going there and slaughtering a whole bunch of people. They just went there to give them the gift of democracy, and it turned out that they were dealing with barbarians. So I kind of wanted to sort of put that as a background, because we should know that this is something that goes back forever in the US. They really things evolved, but of course they are using the same tropes, if you want to use that word, that they used against the indigenous people when they were and then later the Mexicans when they were conquering North America. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like the US Declaration of Independence, it mentions Native Americans as Native Indian savages. And that's still in that document, right? Like the document about liberal values, Western liberal values of equality, justice, pursuit of happiness, or whatever it is. That same document mentions Native Americans as Native Indian savages. So yes, it is indeed the same tropes that we are seeing at play today, for example, in Iran, in Palestine, and in other places.
Mm.
What were all those Indians doing over in America, Josephine? You know what I mean? I thought they were called the Ojibwe people or the Apache people or the Iroquois people. But anyway, they thought they were in India. Yeah, amazing Europeans. Great
Yeah,
navigation. But
yeah.
yeah, coming back to what you're saying, empire just can't take your country because they want to. They always have to have some other reason, some great principle. In the 18th, 19th centuries, of course, it was religious, right? And this is why me, as a socialist, I wouldn't call America the great Satan. You know, the myth or story of Lucifer and his fall from grace, stealing fire from the gods, similar to Prometheus, I suppose, in Greek myth, you know. It gets a bad deal, I suppose, from certain religious ideologies.
So are you saying that it's an
What I
insult
think
to
people
Satan
mean by
to call the
is
US
that
Great Satan?
this is the empire that has one of the most blood on its hands. You know, that's what Iranians mean by that statement. It's not just a religious condemnation; it's a moral condemnation of the slaughter of millions of people. And indeed, if you've seen some of the Lego videos, you know, it starts with the genocide that killed 40 million First Nation people that they called Indians in North America, in South America, millions as well. The destruction of the Aztec and Mayan civilizations, you know, the March of Tears, forced starvation of a lot of the First Nations. So that's how they got the land. Then they imported millions and millions of African people as chattel property, as slaves. And this was the primitive accumulation of capitalism. This was their a way of building the wealth that they had through slavery. So that was a Holocaust that killed millions of people as well. When we think about how they justify their attacks in other countries, they talk of democracy. Democracy is something that's not exclusively European or American. And indeed, there have been many forms of democracy, some most sophisticated forms of democracy, actually, in tribal pre capitalist societies. Not to say that every society was like that, but democracy has been around a long time, and not just in its liberal democratic form, its parliamentary form, or in America, whatever that two-party state is called. Certainly, many people think it's not a democracy. Many people think it's an oligarchy controlled by billionaires at this stage. But the pretext, the doctrine, if you like, of exporting democracy to other countries that have different models is the white man's burden of the 21st century. The white man's burden of the 19th century was to civilize and Christianize savages and save them from the great Satan, save them from going to hell by giving them Christianity. Now, you can't get away with that kind of rubbish these days. A Western liberal democracy purports to be multicultural, purports to respect a plurality of religious points of view. So they need a different kind of non-negotiable doctrine that arrives from, externally.
Enlightenment.
Yes, and used to again civilize the savages, as you said, Josephine.
So the white man's burden, of course, it comes from a poem by what's his face, Rudyard Kipling, who was exhorting the US to take up the white man's burden by going and taming the sullen child, I think he called them, of the Philippines. And of course, William McKinley, the president at the time, tells the story about how he went down on his knees and prayed about, whether he could take up this burden and invade the Philippines. Of course, the Philippines had been colonized by the Spanish for hundreds of years at this point, and they still framed it as bringing Christianity to this country that was majority Catholic at the time. So, in the most incredibly racist terms. And if you read in the People's History of the United States, you can read a lot of how they transferred the language and genocidal tactics of the conquest of the West straight to the Philippines and used incredible brutality to conquer people who'd risen up against the Spanish and were winning their independence. But the US decided that they wouldn't allow that.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Can I jump in? I was really, you know, pleased when Joe brought up the topic of democracy and the existence of more democratic systems elsewhere. This is the thing, right? This is kind of this new canon, right? That there's only one kind of government that is possible. Everyone must follow it, or they are backward, primitive, and open to being invaded or sanctioned or cooled by the imperial hegemon. However, we can see at the moment, over the last, so many years of human history, we can see that there are indeed alternative systems which are more democratic. We need to rethink the concept of how we understand democracy, right? So Joe mentioned how the United States is now considered a oligarchy. I would say that it was always set up to be an oligarchy, a system that supports the corporate interests of the capitalist class, the slave owners, the slave traders, but the empire, right? And its biggest beneficiaries. This is the thing. So when we talk about empire, we must try to understand its nature. What is the empire for? The empire is there to maximize the profits and maximize this principle of limitless growth, right? Capitalism runs on that principle of limitless growth, and the people at the top of the capitalist empire, which are like monopolies, tech monopolies, oil, all these kind of big corporations, they want limitless growth. Sorry, what's going on? Limitless growth. And the way to do that is to access resources and cheap labor. And imperialism is the way that they can do that. And sovereignty, people's rights, grassroots empowerment of workers, all these things are the number one enemies of the empire. Because those kind of things, when people are empowered, like, what we're talking about here, what Joe wants to create over here, and what we all want to do here is to have places where workers have more political control, have control over the economy. That is directly in opposition to the logic of the empire, which is expansion and capitalism, to keep giving profits to this, what do you call, vulturistic ruling class, the Epstein class. So yeah, this democracy becomes what is an excuse. But when I went to Cuba earlier this year and I studied the Cuban system, what I realized is that they don't have Western style multi-party democracy, but what they do have is a worker state with participatory democracy. Like their state is set up with not, most people just think it's the Communist Party, but it's not just the Communist Party. They have the party, which is just like a vanguard. It sets up the principles like a constitutional role. And then it has the mass organizations, including Cuban Women's Federation, the trade unions, the Association of Small Farmers, the committees for the defense of the revolution. And it also has the organs of popular power, which includes, municipal assemblies and assemblies at the provincial level and the National Assembly. So when you look at all these organs together, we can say that almost every single adult in Cuba is involved in the policy-making process. So in some ways, this exceptionalist narrative coming from the West about Western liberal democracy and capitalism has really clouded our imagination and limited our imagination of what is possible. And we're really not in a position to judge democracy because, in my view, democracy, the root of democracy or the foundation of democracy must be to meet the popular aspirations and the needs of the people, which is housing, food, education, public transport, healthcare, security and support in old age. These are the things that a democracy should deliver, and those are the things that capitalism doesn't deliver and wants to take away from us increasingly in order to profit from those areas of inelastic demand like healthcare, like housing, and so forth. So, yeah, we need to rethink our understanding of democracy.
Yeah, so I'll just before I throw over to you, Joe, I was going to say that it's true that the Western countries aren't really democratic, and we can see that in the difference between government policy and public opinion. And one of the things that I think we chase too much as activists is changes in public opinion, but that is not sufficient to make a change in an undemocratic society, and we are an undemocratic society. So what we need to be chasing is popular mobilization, and I believe that that is kind of what you're aiming at, isn't it, Joe? It's building coalitions and getting people to actually be engaged.
Yes, and building coalitions means working with people who have different points of view, different faiths and cultures, and different ideologies, right? We're not all going to agree on the same thing. Can Muslim people work with socialists, work with ecologists, work with people from different countries, Lebanon, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, are quite different, and we all have different kind of religious beliefs, ideological beliefs. But are we against the war? Yes. Are we for New Zealand to have an independent foreign policy? Yes. Well, if you believe in those two things, then you can be in the coalition. Can we have debate within the coalition about tactics or strategy or even politics? Yes. There are many things that leftists disagree on, for example, because we do take principles and points of view seriously and we debate with each other. And that's just within what would be called the socialist community, if you like. But to come back to what Josephine was saying about the achievements of Cuba, part of the ideology, part of the religion, if you like, in America, if we think of it's a secular republic with a lot of WASPs controlling it, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, even Kennedy was too much for them. But, the religion, formal religion, for a long time was anti-communism. They had their witch trials in the 1950s where academics, politicians, even the opera singer Paul Robeson was brought before the Committee for Un-American Activities and asked, are you a witch? Can we burn you? Do you know any other witches? That was how the purges went in the 50s. I think the attack on Cuba and Venezuela and many other left-wing governments of different kinds of ideologies. There's a difference between Venezuela and Cuba. There's a difference between Venezuela and Colombia. But broadly, left-wing movements in Latin America are in favor of redistributing the wealth that was controlled by a small elite to the people who are facing, in many countries, extreme poverty. And there have been achievements along those lines. For the American empire and for Trump to say, I can take it, Cuba is mine, and I can do with it whatever I like, will infuriate and make the blood boil of millions of people, not just throughout Cuba, but throughout the whole continent, that this Yankee conquistador mentality is back, and they will be resisted. And they do see it as a fight between the workers and the poor of the continent and an entitled billionaire Yankee imperialist class. So that's the energy that's going on. And what's very interesting here in Auckland is because many people in the Arab world and in the Muslim faith know that the empire is preparing to attack Nuestra America next. They're going to attack Cuba, they're going to attack Venezuela and probably Colombia too, that there is this affinity, that there is this solidarity between people of different faiths and religions because we know we face the same empire. And some very interesting conversations about religion and politics that go on with that, and people learning from each other about their different systems, their different problems, etc. So when we think of the Great Satan thing, I think things like socialism and communism were the Great Satan in America. That was the religion of that country, and millions, hundreds of millions of people were killed because of that ideology. Back to the Lego videos from Iran, I remember seeing the slaughter of the Native American people, the First Nations first, then the millions of people brought as slaves from Africa as capitalist property to be exploited until death, and then the bombing, nuclear weapons being used in Japan, and millions of people then being bombed in Vietnam, in North Korea, in China, under the pretext of a war against socialism or communism. This war was also used to attack trade unionists and socialists, many of whom were critical of some of these countries or parties, but it was used to destroy democracy here in the West, with many people being hunted out of their jobs in Red Scares, etc. So interesting to think of it in that way too.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that they exported just about everywhere was death squad activity. So, and we see it at absolute peak in the politicide in Indonesia in 1965, which people may be familiar with from the film The Art of Killing. Between 500,000 and 1 million people were slaughtered in the most grotesque manner. But one of the rules, whether it's in South Vietnam or Latin America or whatever, is that that these people go after leftists, and by leftists they often mean people who are educated or suspect in some way. Even people wearing glasses are frequently being killed by death squads because they look too intellectual, and intellectualism is suspect. And this sort of horrific behavior has been exported all around the world, and people have had their children tortured to death in front of them, and this sort of thing. The number of horrible things that came out of this period, and they didn't end with the fall of the Soviet Union, because it's not really about anti-communism. Um, it's about imperialism and the fact that left-wing people empower the local democracy and thus are enemies of the imperial power. So yeah, I just think we always should, when I used the term Great Satan because I was actually referencing the fact that the Iranians during the revolution, who had other enemies, it was not like the US was their only enemy, they used that term to point out that the US was central, So yeah.
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 And so you mentioned the Korean War. I think that a lot of people aren't aware of what happened in the Korean War. And I think people really need to look into that as well. In the Korean War was kind of like what's currently happening to Gaza happened to DPRK, right? Pyongyang was flattened. Almost every city in Korea flattened. 15% of the country's pre-war population died in this brutal assault by the United States and its alliance and anti-communists, right? So communists communists are targets because, like Kieran said, because we oppose the privatization of the resources. We stand for public ownership, and this is in opposition to the empire's goal of expansion, of maximizing profits. I also want to point the listeners' attention to some things that are happening right now. How the United States is trying to consolidate its power in what many are describing as a second Cold War right now, with China as the dominant power rising, as a threat in the United States' view to its power. So I mentioned how the AI corporations are building data centers in India, in many parts of the global south, in Africa, and other parts of the world. But they're also trying to do another thing. They're trying to consolidate extraction of rare earth minerals. At the moment, the China has dominance in rare earth mineral sector, and United States wants to counter this dominance, and so they have been trying to extract and create agreements with peripheral countries. India just last week signed a deal with Marco Rubio when he came to New Delhi, to allowing US corporations to mine rare earth minerals from India. And this is not just India. I want people to just see that this is a pattern happening, right? So the United States is vassalizing a number of countries in the global south in order to counter the impending start of a multipolar world, right? Or the possibility of a multipolar world. They want to block that, and they want to remain the hegemonic force in the world so that they can continue extracting resources and cheap labor from across the world. We're seeing what's going on in the Congolese mines, in Sudan, and all that. So they want this system to continue, so that the oligarchic class can continue to make billions. And we must remember the top 1% of the world, they are really those with the biggest stake in the empire continuing. And that top 1% of the world already owns nearly 45% of the wealth in this whole planet. And they own more than the bottom 50%, more than double of the bottom 50%. So the conditions are really horrific across the world, and we need to stop this oligarchic imperialist class, which in its pursuit of unending profits becomes satanic, becomes evil. And it's like this machine that operates in such brutal ways. And the people in the periphery, in Palestine, in Congo, in Sudan, in many parts of the world, in India, being displaced by these data centers. The result, people facing the worst impacts of climate change are at the front lines of this horrific system, which is simply catering to the extractive rationale of capitalism.
Yeah, I just got to jump in there because you brought up the Korean War, or the Korean genocide, rather. Because I've written extensively about it, and it is central to the establishment of the post-war US empire, because it cemented NSC 68, which was turned the US into a permanent warfare footing, right? So, but which effectively meant a permanent dispersed genocide system. So they're constantly warring against peoples in all sorts of countries, and the nature of their violence is genocidal. It is the lifeblood of their empire, because they're attacking the people, they're not attacking the states. So this began in Korea, where they effectively, it was partly to derail the Chinese. The Chinese were about to unify the country completely by taking Taiwan, which would have deprived the US of its, this kind of offshore islands, which it uses in the same sense that Israel is used to destabilize. It's power projection. It's a way of threatening this other country. So it derailed that unification, which would have taken place very easily. And it effectively destroyed Korean society. The partition in the first place had cut off the north, which was industrialized by the Japanese, but not really food self-sufficient, from the south, which was where all the food was produced. So it was already an extremely destructive partition. And then they swept up and down the entire country and shelled virtually everything before settling back into the middle with this warfare of attrition, during which time they bombed the north so extensively that people were driven to live underground for over a year. So it was very, very, very brutal, and quite a complete destruction, and definitely aimed at the people, even though they were engaged in a genuine war with substantial military on the other side. A lot of the US effort was really in destroying the people under the name of the strategic or attrition process.
And after they had committed a genocide, they still went on to strangle this country, isolate it, punish it for the last 7, 8 decades. I don't know how long it's been now. But this country, this is the impunity of the empire, the lack of accountability. It can commit genocides and then go and punish the people who are subjected to genocide again. So it's like double, triple punishment with the highest forms of punishment like genocide. Like in Gaza, we're seeing how the people in Gaza have been subjected to genocide. They're being concentrated to 40% of what was originally a tiny strip of land. Now it's nearly 70% occupied by Israel, so that the remaining survivors of the genocide concentrated into a smaller part of it, and then they're demanding that they must demilitarize. Excuse me, this is a country without any standing, sophisticated military, navy, air force, nothing. And they are supposed to demilitarize, not the ones who committed genocide. And this is the logic of the empire, right? We committed genocide in Korea. We then put sanctions on them. And then we laugh at them when the people are facing a food crisis. And, which is what Korea has been reduced to, because it only has 20% arable land, North Korea. And so it effectively, by virtue of its geography, has a food insecurity, and exacerbated by isolationism, sanctions, some of the most brutal sanctions. And then we laugh at them. We have been propagandized to use North Korea just as a laughing, stock. Just to signify the worst examples or something. And this is another reason why I want to tell people to look into North Korea. Actually, North Korea is improving at the moment. But I also wanted to talk about those patterns I was mentioning, how the US empire is trying to consolidate its empire through forging relations with new compradors. India is one example, but New Zealand has been an age-old comprador, or not even a comprador. We are, part of the empire. We're part of the imperial core. And we can see, for example, the other day, New Zealand bought 2.7 billion worth helicopters from the United States military-industrial complex. So we also saw how the university sector in New Zealand is being underfunded. The funding is cut. And then we are being asked to open up for investments from the US defense sector. We can also see how, the land stolen from Tangata Whenua, the Mahia Peninsula, is being used to launch satellites which spy on, people in Gaza, but also spy on the enemies of the empire. So this is how the empire consolidates its power, through its alliances, through compradors, through core allies like New Zealand. And this is why, like Joe was saying, we need to cut off from the US empire. And this is a baseline for us to organize, to bring together a coalition, cutting off from the US empire.
Yes, we are living in an emerging multipolar world. I think the American empire is not the only force on this planet, right? And of course, the maneuvers in the Pacific are preparing for World War III, a conflict with China. Hence the need for an anti-communist element of the ideology to justify that conflict. People have many theories about China. Some would argue that it's one of the best capitalists on the planet because the state has control of so many industries there that although they're profitable and making money, that money can then be used to plan economic production. But no matter what we think, it is clear that we are going to have a conflict between these two powers as one hegemon diminishes and the other hegemon rises. We've seen Portugal fall to Spain. We've seen Spain fall to England, and we saw England after World War II fall to the United States of America as the chief hegemon. The Chinese premier asked Trump, had he read the Peloponnesian War, the age-old battle between Sparta and Athens, Athens supposedly democratic, Sparta supposedly a fascist military state. But who won the war? What happened in the Peloponnesian conflict? Mr. Trump probably hasn't read that Western democratic classic book, but I think the Chinese premier's hint was, how can we avoid this World War III conflict between two different systems? Is it possible? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think no matter what characters, what countries, what parties rule, we are in a competitive economic system on this planet between states. And this is Lenin and Bukharin's understanding of imperialism, that the competition that drives capitalism between rival companies also gets elevated to the conflict between nations. The reason that we have wars is not because Duke Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian. The reason that we have wars between nations is because they're expanding, they're trying to colonize, they're trying to get the resources that they need from far-flung countries to get their rubber, to get their oil, to make the cars, to sell to the consumers. But there are contradictions in this system too. As they develop capital, so they develop the possibilities of people seizing control of that capital in far-flung places, as they want their nation to be free, as they want their nation to be democratic. Oh yeah, but not like that. No, not like that. No, don't take our stuff. Oh bugger. So France loses Vietnam. Who comes in to protect the Vietnamese people from their own national liberation and their own independence from empire? The Americans. So the ideology even of the West is contradicting itself. The Americans are preparing to celebrate July the 4th, which was what? A revolution against the British Empire by force of arms and military conflict to beat the British Empire. Both me and Kieran hail from an Irish point of view. And he mentioned that bastard Churchill, leader of the Black and Tans, also slaughter of the Indian people, and the butcher of Gallipoli, where so many Kiwi lives were thrown against the cliff. So we all know about the evil of the British Empire, and that bastard deserved to fall. And we rose up against it in India and Ireland and inspired many other countries to fight for their national liberation. Everybody should support all countries fighting for national liberation. Great to see so many Tangata Whenua standing beside the people of Iran up here and the people of Palestine, Lebanon, Cuba, Venezuela. Indigenous people have been put in the driver's seat in many of the movements and revolutions and rebellions we've seen throughout Nuestra America, and provided some inspiration for Tangata Whenua here, how they could get real control over resources and land, like we see in many of these movements. So, yeah, we are in a time of great, great change. And I think the coalition that we are building is bringing together people from many different points of view, religions, ideologies, and backgrounds, but we look at each other in solidarity. And that's what this war has created. Millions and millions of people looking to each other for solidarity against this brutality, against this evil genocide, against these billionaires who think that they can smash, grab, and kill, take what they want, take our oil, take our land, take our children for their bunkers. Not on our watch. We're going to fight you. And that's why this Saturday, we hope to gather hundreds of people outside the US consulate to say, we're going to strike back against your empire. We're going to stop this war. We're the Rebel Alliance.
The rebels against the empire. So I just have a last question for you, Joe, before I let you go. So you are organizing these protests on the streets of Aotearoa. Um, we are living in this, kind of an age of proliferation of, technology, or, the internet being a new front for the struggle and so forth. Um, what's your, how do you assess protesting on the streets as an effective strategy? And how can we, what is, in your view, the advantage of protesting on the streets above other strategies?
So there's a beautiful saying in Te Reo, kinohi kite kinohi, face-to-face communication. And it means I need to see your face, you need to see mine. You can't see my face at the minute. There's a big American eagle bombing Iranian school children, but you know what I mean. You did see my face before.
Yes.
But what this means is, I think one thing that the oligarchy of America has done is colonize people's consciousness and colonize people's attention span. And the social media that we're subjected to throughout the world has really rattled human beings' lives. Our children are stuck to these machines like face huggers from Alien, at their thing. And maybe in the early days of the anti-capitalist movement, the movement against neoliberalism, where we were using the nascent internet like indie media, activists were creating our own social media 20 years ago. We were uploading video, articles, and photographs through our own hubs like indie media. I think all that's been mediated now by things like Facebook, Insta, etc. And when we can get some hits and we can network with each other, that is no substitution for meeting each other and taking action in meat space, not in cyberspace. That is where our
Right.
power is. They can
Yeah.
shadow ban us, they can sideline us, they can red scare us if we use their technologies, and we should use all technology for the liberation of humanity. But we need to get back to some of the old tried and trusted methods that we used to build a movement of millions of people on the streets against the Iraq war. Get off the internet, get off your Insta and Facebook, go down to your local high street and meet the people on the street, give them a leaflet, put a poster up, because then you are recolonizing social space in reality. If you stay in the bubble of the internet, I think that is where capitalism and the oligarchs would like protests contained, because actually it signifies nothing. It's just
Right.
noise that can
So
be ignored.
kanohi, kite kanohi, eye to eye.
And when we take to the streets, we also find that there is another superpower on planet Earth. On February the 15th, 2003, we put 45 million people on the streets of planet Earth. That was the biggest human protest in history. I think until the Black Lives Matter protests all throughout America, which terrified the US ruling class, 50 million people taken to the streets after the murder of George Floyd. So can we do this again? It's interesting to see the differences 20 years later, that most people think that their activism is something they do on the internet. It's not something that they do out in the street. They don't leaflet a pub. How many people put up posters anymore? It's only through this activity that I've learned some of the benefits of actually doing this kind of activism out in meat space. And if we want to end war, if we want to end capitalism and if we want to unite our world with people, we're going to need revolutions. We're going to need to take the power back, like the Americans did on July the 4th, 1776, with their revolution. So don't lecture anybody else about how dangerous the word revolution is. If you want to take power away from the likes of Trump and Musk, then we need wider democracy. We need control over the resources that the billionaires hoard for themselves. 3,026 of billionaires on this planet. That's all we need to get rid of for everyone to live in paradise, for everyone to be fed, for no more stress, no more homelessness, for the end of many, many sicknesses, and for the next phase of human evolution. We need to get rid of this horrible system. In order to do that, we're going to need people to take power in their own communities and workplaces. And when you get millions of people on the streets marching against war, people can see there is another superpower. It's called people power. It's called workers' power. That's why it's so significant that unions, the CTU, Workers' First Union, the nurses and others have supported the anti-war movement. The trick is, can we mobilize the people?
To summarize, the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be memed. The revolution will not go viral. The revolution will happen in meat space.
Yeah.
Correct.
Well, there's always the counter argument, right? Why didn't the Iraq war protests, didn't achieve its goal? There's also the counter, point that the Black Lives Matter protest didn't really lead to any material gains, but the answer to that would be the power is material, like you said, right? The resources hoarded by the billionaires are material. It is the land, it is the buildings, it is the property, it's the assets, it's the forests, it's the minerals. So these are material resources which we need to seize materially and not through the internet. So perhaps that is the counter argument from you.
Yes, I mean, if we need to end the system of war, I think what many of us saw in 2003 was, even when we had millions of people out in the streets in the biggest democratic protests in human history, the likes of Tony Blair and George Bush ignored that anyway. And we know people like Trump and Starmer in England and Luxon here will ignore democratic protest, even if it was hundreds of thousands of people. That's where we just don't wait around. That's where the next stage of an anti-war movement, and we learned this lesson from 2003, is actually shut the system down. That slogan became very popular during the movement against the genocide in Gaza. It started off as a radical left slogan, was seen too far, but now chanted by everybody all around the world. We need to shut the goddamn system down, shut the whole system down. The only way we can do that is through general strikes led by workers in their unions. That will shut the system down. That will shut down the power of the billionaires. They can't, Jeff Bezos can't run Amazon without the likes of people like Chris Smalls, the workers who pack the packages. So this, in the end, is the power that we have to shut the economic system down. They can't kill all the workers. And that's why it's great to have unions and union leaders involved in this coalition.
Yeah. So I think that one of the things about the visible presence in rallies, getting out in the streets, is that it's a foundation, it's a platform. And Josephine mentioned that Black Lives Matter didn't achieve its goals, but it was an educational experience for people. And we see from the reactions to ICE in Minnesota that they had built networks, and they were using in real life communications, going door to door to communicate with each other, not relying on social media, which is, as you pointed out, Joe, it is mediated, it's controlled, and in the end, it will always be limited. If we start to make headway with social media, they will simply switch it off. So we do need to build up those, I said
Human
meat
to
space. You
human.
can take that in two different ways, because meat is, we can meet people as well as being meat. Anyway, so
Just on the
it's probably
Minneapolis
about
thing
time
there
to
as well,
wrap up, is
Kieran.
it? Um, do you
Just
guys
quickly
want
on
to
the
wrap up about now
Minneapolis.
and just get you to finish off again, Joe?
Yeah, just quickly on Minneapolis there, because
Oh, yeah.
Black Lives Matter rose up in Minneapolis with the murder of George Floyd, just a couple of blocks away from where Alex uh, Preddy and others were killed by ICE. But the response in the end that toppled that little petty Hitler guy, the little small fella, what was his name again? Forget Trump's
Bavino.
henchman's name.
Bavino.
Yeah, yeah, there was a general strike in Minneapolis. This was an American city in
That's
the
right.
1930s where the Teamster Rebellion happened, and it was under workers' control in the 1930s, led by socialists, revolutionary socialists. And so this power, which was supposed to be historical, again is coming back in America. Lots of working class Americans looking at the billionaire class, thinking that we need a socialist solution to this problem. Is this just rhetoric? Well, the government of the mayor of New York City, kind of quite a small kind of town. You might have heard of it, New York. But, he's Muslim. He calls himself a socialist. He's in favor of taxing the rich and redistributing wealth in favor of the working class. These ideas are becoming popular again in America. And the general strike that we saw in ICE, that happened. So is it possible that we can talk about these methods? For those who say marching didn't stop the war in Iraq, when we had millions of them, we've learned a lesson from that time. And it's to combine massive street protests when we get to that level with the power that we have as workers or in the community to stop the system. And when you stop the system, the emperor has no clothes, the billionaires have no power. Without us, that's how we can build a better world. Without war, without racism, and without genocide.
I think that's a great place to wrap up. So that was a special episode of One of 200. Kieran, last thoughts?
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you both for joining us. Do you want to quickly remind people of the details of what's happening on Saturday, Joe?
Yeah, so 2 p.m. on Saturday, Aotearoa Square in Auckland. We've got some great speakers. Camilla Bilic from the Labour Party, high up on the list, so very good. We've got Ricardo Mendes March from the Green Party, a great friend of the migrant workers, and a Mexican comrade, Mexican Kiwi comrade. So great to have Nostra America represented in our speakers list. Hahona Ormsby, our Maori comrade, who was tortured by the Israelis and spat on by Ben-Gvir when he was abducted by Israeli pirates in the Mediterranean and taken to the port of Ashad to be tortured for a week. Hahana is suffering the effects of that torture, but he's going to speak out on Saturday. Sandra Gray, Secretary of the Council of Trade Unions, many other union speakers. Kelby Dalton from Americans Abroad Against the War, who's an American socialist from Texas. Yes, there are socialists in Texas, Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth. I was starting to see over the last few years just how many good American people there are, and they're getting organized. They're going to fight back. Trump has had this radicalizing effect, not only on the rest of the world, but in the belly of the beast itself. So some great speakers. But yes, anybody need posters or leaflets? I'm easy to find. We'll see you there.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Josephine. That has been a special episode of 10200. Like, share, subscribe, join our Patreon, eat your greens, do all of the stuff. All right. And we will catch you next time.
Takite.
See ya. Bye.